Greetings, traveler. I am Sonox, the teller of tales. Would you like to hear one? Well, this one is called "And So the DM Ruins the Game." Long story here. For context, this is a play-by-play post, sort of freeform game with a PvP focus. There are 13 groups of 50 people. Most of these are NPCs, with 4 of the 13 groups each having a number of players, in a valley fighting to earn supremacy for their group by capturing or killing all the other combatants. Everyone arrives in a valley and are told how to capture and mark other combatants as servants. They are also told how to earn better gear by capturing castles and enemy standards, etc., etc. Cue a few months of trials and tribulations as the players expand their knowledge and fight. It was a great time. Then came the red flags. The group I was in was fighting extremely successfully. We had made an alliance with another group, and between the two of our groups we had control over 300 people total, which by this point was the majority of combatants left alive in the valley. At this point, the admin decided to roll to see how many of our captured servants would run away. Our group was 150 strong. Our allies were about the same. In order to decide how many of our servants would run, she rolled a D50. Process that for a second. A D50, up to an entire third of either of our armies, that she was okay with deciding to throw away. Cue the roll. It was a 47. So she had 47 of our group's supposedly compelled servants just run away. And we had to waste a significant amount of time in-game hunting them down and dealing with them. When we questioned them as to why they ran away, the admin's response was, "We got bored." Straight up just, "We were bored." That was all the reasoning we got for an entire third of our army simply effing evaporating into the night. Some time later, we were coming up on a castle which turned out to have 90 people in it, give or take. We had an army of roughly 250 marching on the walls. The people in the castle, they were led by a player who was not very smart. Said player decided to give up the castle and have roughly 75 of their number run away. On foot, in 2 feet of snow, in an open field, against mounted cavalry. They tried to couch their fleeing by firing explosive arrows, 7 of them. I should like to point out that we know for a fact that they only received the explosion arrows that morning. Our army? We had electrified stunner arrows and were given a total of 7 for the entire game. So, sure. But then we find out that apparently there are few people inside the castle. They had at least 7 more. That's 14 explosive arrows all at once, given in one day, when our group wasn't even allowed 7 electric stunner arrows. Having fired these and wasted most of them because they rolled low, they tried to run, as I said before, on foot in the snow against cavalry. The GM had both sides roll with the same modifier. No advantage for the cavalry, no disadvantage for trying to run on foot in 2 feet of snow, and of course, the runners rolled decent and somehow managed to stay ahead of cavalry in 2 feet of snow, until they don't, at which point the player in charge decides to have this unruly mob in the snow try to turn and fight said cavalry. Keep in mind, most of the runners have no armor at all, and of course, admin declares none of them roll disadvantage, even though the runners are outnumbered more than 3 to 1. They fight a while, start to lose, the player in charge orders them to try and retreat, while the cavalry is literally on top of them, and of course, guess what? They roll no disadvantage. Cue a guy who gets into his head to try and hold the line. He takes a normal sword and is wearing no armor and proceeds to fight a swordsman in full plate, mounted on a horse, with a literally electrified sword. Guess what? He rolls with no disadvantage. Armored rider rolls with no advantage. For reference, said character without armor was literally made as a throwaway by a guy whose main PC got captured. This PC was pretty boilerplate and only had swordsmanship as his main skill, which of course, given the way the bonuses are set up, he got to start with a +10 to swordsmanship, which is the highest value of any PC. So he was rolling at a +10 against a +4 when the +4 PC was fully armored, had an electric sword, and was on a horse. But wait, it only gets better. The NPCs are continuing to lose. Said PC with +10 swordsmanship manages to bring down the mounted rider somehow. Cue my PC. I am in full plate, with an electrified blade and an electrified shield. on a chariot with 2 fully armored NPCs carrying electrified spears. We ride to run over the guy. Instead of rolling speed to jump out of the way, he got to roll, for some reason, with his swordsmanship modifier. In jumping out of the way, he manages to wound one of our fighters, because reasons. I ask if I can roll for my 2 named NPCs on the chariot with me, and I get told no. So of course, the next round, one of the enemy nameless NPCs get an individual roll of 18 that manages to destroy the chariot without even being allowed to counter-roll to avoid it. Those 2 named NPCs, in full plate, both of them get killed the next turn by one random NPC and no armor with a normal sword, because of course they did. And of course, in that turn after the chariot is destroyed, my character is thrown to the ground. We have them outnumbered by this point, about 189 to 37. So we write roughly 20 NPCs going after this one PC with a +10 swordsmanship mod, and his friend who somehow killed 2 elites. Guess what happened next? An admin-run NPC who is trying to flee turns and conveniently pulls the last 2 explosive arrows to fire on us. They roll high and instantly kill my PC, despite there being explicitly listed your player characters will not be killed or removed from the game without your consent. This was the point a lot of arguing started and people started leaving. I saw the aftermath of that turn, despite trying to run on an open field through 2 feet of snow against cavalry, turning to try and fight said cavalry on foot as a mob, and then trying to run again while outnumbered more than 5 to 1. Every single named character except one of the enemy team gets away. None of them rolled super high. Our team lost 3 of its strongest player characters to damage that should have been prevented by the armor and shields we earned. And of course, when we argue that, why is this guy with no armor and only a normal sword rolling with no disadvantage against a mounted and armored rider with an electrified sword, or against any of these other absurd circumstances, you'd better stop arguing. The cherry on the cake is the roughly 1/3 of active players who are sucking up hard and who, despite reading this exact same stuff I did, insist that the mods have a plan. Gee, those bored servants beg to differ, and that they're running this fairly. So apparently being outnumbered 5 to 1 on an open field in 2 feet of snow with no armor against armored soldiers carrying electrified swords mounted on horses means you roll with no disadvantage. That is the end of that tale. If you'd like to hear another, I have one for you. This one is titled, My Brother and His Pony Problem. Hello. First time posting. This story happened approximately 12-ish years ago when I was 10 or 11 years old and a completely starry-eyed newbie at D&D. Nowadays, I'm a pretty seasoned player who's also wrote some of my own campaigns, but we all start somewhere. I was always fascinated with D&D since I was very young because my dad and brother played it and I looked up to both of them a lot. I also loved the concept and I liked fantasy, so I was in fact very overjoyed when they finally let me in on the fun. Now that I'm older, I can recognize that my dad and brother aren't actually great DMs, my brother especially. This story in particular always comes to mind, and it took me a combo of years and meeting new people to finally realize my brother was being a jerk for no reason, and some people are just bad DMs. For context, my brother's 8 years older than me, so he was 20-ish here, and he disapproves of everyone and everything. He's one of those DMs who hates it when players have too much fun, and for him, the rules come first before anything else. He's also super high and mighty about the different editions and swears by 3.5, and openly says that people who play 5th edition are mentally deficient. This story is just one example of his approach to D&D. So, I am a very excited kid who knows next to nothing about the rules. And boy was I ready to go on an adventure. I rolled up a half-elf bard named Onyx. I always loved bards because of Tom Merlin from The Wheel of Time. And my cousin and uncle are my fellow party members, but their characters aren't relevant here. This is 2nd edition AD&D, by the way. So after a battle and some looting, the party stopped at a small village, and we had downtime before we set off on our quest, investigating a rumor in a distant city. I had a lot of gold and wanted to spend it, so I thought that it would be a good idea to buy a mount for the journey. Because my character was so small, I had her purchase a pony. My brother was not happy about this and asked me several times if I was sure, stressing that this would be an absolute waste of money. I insisted that I was sure because I didn't think it was a big deal, and he didn't know that the main reason I went straight for a pony was because my brother had a companion who rode a pony in a separate game that my dad was running, and I wanted to emulate that. Anyway, I buy my pony, and in an attempt to sound more grown up and serious, I name him Snake Eyes. My brother doesn't hesitate to tell me how stupid he thought this was. I was hurt, but we had an adventure to go on. So Onyx and Snake Eyes were only a little bit down the road when I realized that my brother was not going to let me off easy here. It was quickly established in the narrative that Snake Eyes was the most stubborn, uncooperative, ill-tempered pony you could ever meet. He constantly tried to bite at Onyx, wouldn't listen to a single command, and kept trying to run off at every free moment. It was quickly becoming unfun for me, and I started to resent my purchase, but I pressed on, trying to hold on to any optimism I had left. We came across an illusion of a fire, and we could not convince Snake Eyes to walk through it. I understand the logic here, but my brother practically held up the game for 20 minutes trying to force me to abandon my pony by making it refuse to continue. After a lot of deliberation, my uncle suggested we blindfolded Snake Eyes and lead him through the fire, which my brother begrudgingly allowed. Finally, at setting up camp, I was feeling pretty bad, 11-year-old child guilt, and was trying to build some kind of bond with Snake Eyes by feeding him apples and petting him. But my brother made it clear that Snake Eyes still absolutely hated me. Anyways, in the middle of the night, orcs attacked our campsite and we had to defend it. Despite being tied to a tree, Snake Eyes managed to free himself in the confusion and took off running into the forest, never to be seen again. Well, at least until we found his corpse later, gutted and strung up in a tree by orcs. I was very upset at the loss of my pony and my money, and as a kid I found this a very discouraging introduction to D&D, because I wanted to have a pony like that other character, and my brother had to ruin it. After the session, I confronted my brother and asked him why he had to be such a butt, paraphrasing about my pony and why he had to make it uncooperative and desperate to run away. And he just shrugged and said, "It's your fault. You should have bought a war pony. They listen better." Rest in peace, Snake Eyes. You are still missed. Well, that concludes that tale, but there is a sequel, and this one is called My Brother and His Flavor Problem, from the story before. Hello, you may remember me. A few days ago, I posted a story about the tragically short life of Snake Eyes the pony. You guys on the sub seem to really get a kick out of my brother as a DM, and as a person, so I have another story about him to share with you today. Now, as some of you have kindly pointed out, while my brother may be a big jerk about the rules a lot of the time, that isn't really the source of his issue as a DM as much as his aggressive need for total control. So I do apologize to all the rules lovers out there. I never meant to imply following the rules is a bad thing. It's always about being a jerk. So my brother hates flavorful character backgrounds and thinks they're a waste of time. Before you ask, I don't know what happened to him in his life that made him fly into a rage at the thought of people having fun, but that's how he is. My brother is Chekhov's gunslinger, because you don't include anything in D&D if it's not going to serve a functional purpose. He has said, "I find it really annoying when players want to make special characters with fancy backstories. It's way more respectable and interesting if your character is just a normal guy on an adventure." In his eyes, he's doing you a favor by DMing. And you have to understand that it's his story that you have the privilege to participate in. The players do not get to tell him what the story is about. The characters are just in his story for you to interact with the world. That is all. If you handed my brother a multi-page backstory, he would look you in the eyes as he threw it in the trash. So the story today is 50% about his hatred of writing characters creatively and 50% about his major control issues. So, on to the story. This takes place about a year or two after Snake Eyes the pony was laid to rest. So I was about 13 years old. My brother, 22-ish, was home visiting from college, and I asked him to play D&D since my dad was only DMing for me once a year. My brother said sure, and I was so happy to play that I didn't consider that of course there was going to be a catch. I called my cousin and step-uncle, different uncle from the first story, to come over and play D&D. While we were waiting for them to show up, my brother said it was time to make characters. Personally, character creation is one of my favorite parts of D&D, and I felt this way back then too, so I was excited. excited. I was going to play another bard because I always play bards and he knows this. So I started saying, "All right, I think I'll play a half-elf bard." But he cut me off and said, "What makes you think you get to decide?" I stammered at this because I was totally confused. I thought the whole point of D&D was making your own character. He told me that character creation takes too long, so he would be writing our characters for us. I asked again if he could at least write the character I wanted to play, because it would take the same amount of time, and he said absolutely not. So he started rolling dice and saying that he was going to make me play a guy character and probably a dwarf paladin or something. Now, at the time, I was a young girl right on the cusp of puberty in middle school who was extremely insecure about my perceived femininity because I was a little overweight back then. D&D was a huge escape for me at the time to play the pretty girls I wished I could be. I did not want to play a guy, especially not a dwarf, and so I started panicking at this. After a bit of an anxious meltdown of me begging my brother to not make me a guy, not make me a dwarf, please let me play a bard, I didn't want to self-associate myself with the masculineness of a tank character class either. I even told him why I was upset, because I had very low self-esteem about how people saw me. He just argued that dwarves are awesome, and I should feel honored to play one. By the time my cousin and step-uncle showed up, my brother sighed and I thought he was going to cut me some slack. But then he said, "Class, race, or sex? I'll only let you pick one." Before I could comment, he followed with, "Or we could just not play. You want to play, right?" Understanding my power in the situation and not wanting to make a scene in front of my cousin and step-uncle, I told my brother that I at least wanted to be a girl because that was probably the most important to me and I knew he'd make me a guy if I didn't pick it. So my brother continued to roll dice and write my entire character for me in front of my eyes. No input from me at all. My cousin and step-uncle weren't as bothered by having their characters written for them. So it was time to start the game, and my brother distributed our character sheets and described our characters and the backgrounds to us. No surprise here, my brother handed me a dwarf fighter, but he did me a favor because at least she was a girl, and he didn't waste time to describe the impressively thick beard she had. I was holding back tears. But what really did it for me was when he turned to my step-uncle and said, "So you're playing a half-elf bard." I almost had a breakdown at this, and looking back, I should have left right then and there. But I was still an insecure 13-year-old girl who was so D&D starved that I was desperate to just play, even if it meant I had to put up with playing a buff and ugly dwarf woman while my step-uncle across the table got to play the character of my dreams. I don't know how I managed to do it without bursting into tears. P.S. Nothing against dwarves, masculine women, and tanks. This was just my preteen perception of those classes at the time. Nowadays, I know that you can be a tank and be feminine at the same time. Well, that concludes that tale, but there is another. Let's call it the trilogy. If you're interested, this tale is called My Dad and His Bear Problem, from the same person. Okay. Before you ask, I have no idea what's up with the men in my family and animal companions either. Hi again. Last week I wrote about Snake Eyes the pony and was very pleased by his resulting popularity, because I always wanted him to live in more hearts than just mine. Now that dream is achieved. My second story wasn't as popular, but those of you who read both have really helped me come to terms with the reality that my brother treaded the lines of emotional abuse far more than just being a bad DM. Writing these stories has brought on a lot of catharsis for me, so I'm going to continue posting as many stories as I remember until I eventually run out of content or am accused of making it all up. Whatever comes first. I can assure you that all these accounts are true, and up until 2018, the RPG side of my life has just been one big horror story. So, on to today's story. I figured you guys are all exhausted from hating my brother so much, so we'll take a break from him and talk about my dad. So about my dad. He's been playing since the 80s and is completely unwilling to adapt, which is why I grew up playing 2nd edition until I was 20. He's very much a better DM than my brother, but not by the hugest margin. Put it like this, he's much more inclined to make the game fun, knows when it's okay to be looser with the rules, and isn't mean to just upset or punish players like Big Bro is. However, I would say he is very limited creatively, which caused him to develop a very bad knack for railroading, which, oh boy, is my next story going to cover that. Anyways, I don't fault him too much for his low creativity because some people are just weaker in that aspect. His best friend growing up was one of those mega DMs who built a whole world, and my dad really admired him but couldn't replicate it himself. Some people just don't have the spark in them, and that's okay. What's not okay, however, is my dad's sick sense of humor. See, he's stubborn, and it contributes horribly to his railroading, but my dad would also just do awful things because he thinks he's a lot funnier than he actually is. He also really enjoys putting players in uncomfortable situations. A short example, once in a previous game, the party was split. My cousin had to mercy kill an NPC who was maimed beyond repair from an Iron Maiden, and my dad just decided that entire party teleported across the whole dungeon just so everyone could conveniently walk in on my cousin killing this NPC, so awkward misunderstandings could ensue. So to put it simply, my brother will do things to hurt players, but my dad likes embarrassing his players. I don't know, everyone has their kinks apparently. This story is just an example of my dad's tomfoolery and lack of limits to what he finds funny. So I'm 11 here, which means this is only a few months after the tragedy that is Snake Eyes the Pony, and my dad is running Palace of the Silver Princess. Original orange cover, I will fight you, for me and my cousin. Since there was only 2 of us, my dad supplemented our party with some NPCs, but the only relevant one here is Dewey the Cleric. So we come across this cave where we hear a lot of growling in the distance, and we follow the sound only to find a scared, starving, emaciated bear cub chained to the wall. My cousin just wants to leave it, but I'm an 11-year-old girl and a huge animal lover, so my heart breaks and I insist we help it. I fed it rations, it ate the rations, but it's still a bear, so it hasn't stopped showing hostility towards the party. Concerned, I begged Dewey the Cleric to do something because as a godly man, you should know a few tricks, right? So Dewey sits down next to the bear for a couple of rounds, whispering a lot of things, and before we know it, the bear has went from hostile to sweet. This is where I first learned about animal friendship. I was overjoyed at this, and we set the bear free, and I'm pretty sure I named it Teacup. So we set off to explore the rest of the dungeon with our new animal companion in tow. It didn't take long for the problems to start, the problem here being a pit trap. The rope we tied across the opening of the pit was good enough for a party member, but bears aren't really known for their tightrope walking abilities, so we had to think up an alternative. When my character was trying to explain how the party could rig up some kind of pulley system for Teacup to get across the pit using a couple of ropes and a bedroll, a wandering monster was triggered on our side of the hallway, and Teacup barreled forward in a panic and jumped into the pit. The wandering monster was dispatched quickly, and the party looks down in the pit to see if Teacup survived the landing. In all honesty, Dad, it would have been better if you just killed the bear right then and there. But no, my dad did not mince words as he described how Teacup's body was contorted and broken from the impact, but still alive and crying out in pain. My dad took special care to illustrate how Teacup's front paws were bent entirely backwards, wrist bones broken through the skin and sticking out where we could see them. Blood was everywhere, of course. Poor Teacup locked eyes with my character almost accusingly, as if asking why I put it in such a situation in the first place. The whole time my dad had the biggest poop-eating grin as he said all of this. My character had to euthanize Teacup with an arrow. I was the only archer. I cried. My dad joked about this story for years. He actually thought it was the funniest thing ever, both the cold-blooded bear homicide and my reaction to it. Teacup the bear had an even shorter lifespan than Snake Eyes the pony. That concludes all of our tales for today. If you'd like to hear another, come back again and I shall tell you one. If you'd like to hear one right now, perhaps watch another video. There's a few off to the side.